Hi everyone, this is the Spring Anchor tutorial series and this is part 1. We are going to break down the prompt. Before we even look at the prompt, I want you to hear the goals for this tutorial. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the language in the prompt as well as really what you're going to be addressing in your paper as a whole. By this point, you should already know the prompt, but here it is again. Using the novel Things Fall Apart and historical sources, analyze the motives for African imperialism and evaluate their impacts on African society. Consider both the European and indigenous perspectives. To understand this prompt fully, we're going to break it down into 4 different parts. Here we go. The first part of the prompt is using the novel Things Fall Apart and historical sources. So what does that mean? Well, it means using your novel Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe, as well as all the historical sources you've gotten so far regarding imperialism in Africa from your history classes. Each class may look a little bit different, or the packet of information you may have may look different, but it's pretty much all the same authors. There's Charles Napoleon Descartes, there's Edmund Morel, there's Rudyard Kipling, Cecil Rhodes, Lord Lugard, and I think a couple of others. Those are your historical sources and the novel. That's all you'll be using in this particular anchor. Part 2 of the prompt requires you to analyze the motives of African imperialism. Now, you should remember these motives: economic, exploratory, ideological, political, religious, and social. You're not going to see a lot of exploratory motives in this prompt or really in the documents, so I wouldn't worry too much about that one. These other 4, though, economic, ideological, political, religious, and social, they're all over the place. You can use any of the ones you'd like. You're probably going to want to talk about a couple of them. Don't talk about religious and social, though, because you'll wind up saying the same thing. It'll get very redundant in your paper. Talk about religious or social, and then you can talk about economic motives or ideological motives, although oftentimes the ideological motives are often motivated by religion or other social issues. So you're going to look at those motives, and you're going to try to understand why and how did those motives bring Europeans to Africa. The third part of your prompt asks you to evaluate their impacts on African society. We're talking about evaluating the impacts of those particular motives, which means you have to weigh the positives and the negatives. What were the good things? What were the bad things about the motives of imperialism and how they impacted the Africans? The final part of the prompt says to consider both the European and indigenous perspectives. This is always a little bit confusing. When you're talking about the motives, you're kind of talking about the European perspectives. And when you're talking about the impacts, you're kind of talking about the indigenous perspectives already. So by following all the other parts of this prompt, you'll sort of be addressing both the European and indigenous perspectives. But make sure that as you write your paper and as you think about constructing your argument, that you have both sides in there, what the Europeans were interested in and the impact on the Africans or the indigenous themselves. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. In summary, you only have to do a few things for this prompt. You have to use Things Fall Apart and your historical sources. So you need to use both Things Fall Apart and those historical sources. You also need to analyze different motives for imperialism and then evaluate the impact that those motives had on African society. Finally, you need to make sure that you're discussing these events from both European and indigenous perspectives. That's pretty much it. We'll see you in the next Anchor tutorial, and thank you, Mr. Mize.